We have to do it together, and you are really in forefront.
Oh.
And you are, I know exactly that you are the right person to get this.
Thank you
So please.
But I will leave it for now, maybe. I want to first say it's a true pleasure to be here. This morning, my husband and I got a glance at Norway and its beautiful nature, and it was just breathtaking. You're very lucky to be the custodian of this beautiful land. Today, things are a lot worse than 2005. As you can see, these are a few pictures. The picture all the way to the right and the one all the way to the left. These are pictures that were taken about 2 months ago outside of Fallujah. People are running and escaping, escaping gangs that kill people. And the picture in the middle, as you can see, it's an old lady carrying a young man on her shoulder, on her side. Obviously, he is incapable of walking himself, so I wonder who they are, but these pictures were offered to me by Dr. Daraji, who is a physician at Fallujah General Hospital. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that Iraq is now a nation of refugees. People are escaping, going wherever they can to escape war and extreme difficult situations. Today, between Iraq and Syria, there are 15 million people who have been displaced. I was just talking to Deputy Mayor, and she was telling me Norway has a problem with refugees, displaced people who come here, and society is not ready for them, and they have seen hardship coming here. So we have a global problem. Again, there is some more statistics. What it boils down to is that more than 1 million people have been killed in Iraq since 2004. These are some of my collaborators. To the left is Dr. Samira Al-Ani. She's a pediatrician who is now a refugee. I have not been able to contact her for 6 months. She's the first woman with whom I worked, and we did a study in Fallujah, a city in the north of Iraq. I will show you, near Baghdad. In the right-hand side, in the middle, there is Dr. Al-Sabak. I don't have a pointer, but the man in the middle is Dr. Al-Sabak, and his students on the two sides. He is a doctor in Basra Medical School, and his hospital is called Basra Maternity Hospital. It's the largest hospital in the area. It receives more than 60% of deliveries each year. So it's quite a strong, big hospital receiving a lot of women who deliver children in that hospital. We did a study there, and I will get into those data. What is very, very scary is this study that came out in March, a couple of months ago, by Physicians for Social Responsibility. I don't know, have people seen this report? Anybody has seen this report in this room? This is an extremely important report, but it has gotten very little attention. What it basically says that their investigation has found that probably 2 million people have died in the Middle East. And this is a conservative estimate, because the data they have from Syria is very shaky. It's not quite as high as it should be. And people killed in Yemen and Somalia and in these places, they are not included in these 2 million. So what it tells you, it's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe, monumental, genocidal situation. And my friend, Dr. Al-Ani, the photograph before, she told me over 6 months ago, she said, I want you to know, a genocide is being committed against people of Iraq. And in March, there is a document that says that she was right. So what I'm telling you is that it's an enormous humanitarian crisis which needs to be talked about and addressed somehow. Before I came here in past October, me and Dr. Al-Sabak, I was not able to bring Dr. Al-Ani, but Dr. Al-Sabak and I, and you see in the posters, gave a big tour of US universities. We gave a talk at Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, a number of universities. These are the flyers for those talks. We tried our best to bring our message to all of these scientific communities. They have heard the same study that you will hear today, they have heard. So I'm hoping we can mobilize the academics to take action, to demand that things be different, and that this would be addressed. In Iran, I have traveled and given talks at the Sharif University, which is the top university, Isfahan University, Tehran University. So in Iran also, the studies that we've done has gained attention. Articles have been written about it, and I think that we have been heard there also. A lot of European outlets, Al Jazeera, for example, they have given us some time and they have published the results of our studies. So aside from inside of the United States, where we have very little exposure, from outside we have been able to bring attention to our findings. Now, the studies we've done in 3 areas of Iraq. The dust quality has changed since the bombings and the information that I give you about how dust in Iraq has gotten quite contaminated with very toxic material. So this is a quotation from US military officers, in which they are saying that Iraqi dust contains very highly toxic metals, as well as microbes, small viruses and bacteria that can be the cause of many different illnesses. So the dust that you see in these pictures, the quality has changed. It has become quite toxic. Now, what are some of the sources of pollution that makes this dust toxic? First, I have put abandoned junkyards and tank graves. So when the United States invaded Iraq, they brought with them a lot of military hardware, tanks and trucks and weaponry, enormous sizes, metal, and also a lot of depleted uranium came with them. If you want, you can see lots of these pictures on the web about these junkyards. This is a junkyard right outside of the US military base in Tajid. I will talk about Tajid a little bit later. It becomes more important later. This is what you see, total junk all over the place. These are a little bit older pictures, but the newer ones are not much different because they have simply put these trucks on the side of the road. This is Basra 4 months ago, just outside. And there are miles and miles of this trash sitting all over the country, slowly weathering and releasing toxic stuff, including depleted uranium, into the environment, into the dust, into the water, into the food, into the people. Another pile of junk outside of Basra. So that was one source of pollution, continually contaminating the earth in Iraq. Another source is what recently came out to be known. Maybe the last 4 years, there was a lot of noise about burn pits on US military bases. When I first did my first article about Iraq, we didn't know about these burn pits in Iraq and how they contribute to health effects of women and children in Iraq. Only 5 years it's been coming out. Why? Because a lot of military personnel in US Army have come back to Iraq and they have been showing all kinds of cancers, respiratory effects, nervous system effects. So they were wondering why it is. It turns out, let me show you some pictures. Across Iraq, there is over 500 military bases. This is a general picture of only about 70 of these military bases. Notice around all these big cities, there is a whole lot of these military bases. Apparently, on these military bases, for about 7 straight years, and as far as we know, even to this today, there were large areas where they burnt whatever they didn't want to bring back to the US. Starting from computers, tires, you name it, unexploded weaponry, bombs and shells and things like that. So imagine you are a pregnant woman living in Fallujah. Look how many military bases around Fallujah. You are exposed to the emissions that comes from these burn pits, and you are constantly inhaling it. American military personnel would be inhaling it for 6, 7, 8 months, 9 months. They would go back to US. And they are grown men. They are not as sensitive to exposure to pollution. as a woman who's pregnant or a child that's growing. So this is another source of major pollution in Iraq. Of course, military bases all over the world are a major source of pollution. These are some of the things you find on them. Solvents, rust removers, petroleum fuel, all of this you can find on every military base. And in fact, it is not only Iraq. US military bases inside US are a major source of pollution. But in Iraq, this was a huge source of exposing pregnant women and growing children to toxic, very toxic emissions. Here's a picture of a burn pit. You see this very thick cloud coming out. Look at that. This is a highly toxic emission coming out of these burn pits. I have quite a few. And some of these burn pits are as big as 10 acres. Imagine like huge, huge areas where you just burn everything and the smoke comes out and it's inhaled by public. And here's another large one. As far as we know, some of these burn pits have been stopped, but we don't know if all have been. So as far as we know, they may be still functioning. This is an incredible picture a friend sent me. Again, this is a military base with huge smoke coming out. So, by 2011, 2010, enough soldiers from the United States had come back with illnesses, and there's been enough noise made by US soldiers that finally the Institute of Medicine made a big report. It's about 200 pages, and in it they evaluated air samples from US military base in Iraq, one US military base in Iraq, and they found all these compounds extremely toxic to nervous system, to reproductive system, you name it, causing cancers. They reviewed these air samples and they said a combination exposure to these compounds could result in health effects, adverse health effects in adults. But unfortunately, this report did not at all deal with exposure of the locals, especially more sensitive groups, for example, pregnant women and children. I tell you this as a toxicologist, and I'm sure my colleagues agree, because it's the knowledge that we have gained for the past 30 years, that pregnant women, growing children, fetuses are several folds more sensitive to exposure to these compounds. They're several fold more sensitive in being exposed, because as the woman is pregnant, the cells are dividing very rapidly, they are dividing and becoming new cells, and they are all very sensitive to exposure to toxins. Exposure to toxins will affect them much more severely. None of that has been addressed in this report, unfortunately. This is why I feel it is a big neglect on the part of the Institute of Medicine for sure. They should have talked about how this would affect pregnant mothers and children, especially because they live there all the time. They will never leave. Soldiers leave, they go back to the United States. Mothers and children don't leave, it is their home. They live there and they're exposed to it for a much longer time, and they are more sensitive to it. So as you can see, they are much more likely to be harmed by these polluting compounds. So this was a second source of pollution. What else? Chemical warheads. I don't know, has anybody heard about a discovery of 5,000 chemical warheads in Iraq, which was found and reported in New York Times? Anybody has heard about it? Well, in October, there was several reports in the New York Times talking about the fact that over 5,000 chemical warheads, chemical weapons, were found in across Iraq. I think I have a map of where they found it. These are the places where they found it. So these 5,000 chemical weapons were scattered across Iraq. The United States found it, and they brought it to Camp Taji, the same place with all those junkyards around it. And there, they felt they need to get rid of it somehow, because it is too embarrassing to show all these chemical weapons with US name on it. And who they had sold it to was Saddam, the worst man on earth. So it would be too embarrassing to go through the proper channels and dispose of them, because there is international agreements. If you have these things, you will record them, and then they will be put through rigorous examination, and eventually there are ways to diffuse them and neutralize them, and it can be done. But instead of doing that, what they did is they detonated them, they blew them up. areas. Now, what comes of the detonation of these compounds is persistent.
The pointy first one is in the middle.
Oh, it is this one.
Yeah!
Oh, there you go. Sorry.
Finally.
So the idea is when you blow these chemical weapons, the residues remain. They are also highly toxic and they remain in the soil, in the water, another source of major pollution in Iraq. Next. So what I'm telling you is that there is this is what we know of the sources that are continually polluting Iraqi soil and water and air. Now, there may be other things we don't know about yet, but this is quite a lot. This is basically showing you that shells that were exploded, what I just told you. This is the camp. Oops, sorry. This is a picture of the camp. This is the junkyards outside of the camp. A lot of toxins were released into the environment, and we don't know how many Iraqis were affected by it. Now, everybody is very interested in depleted uranium. Is anybody has questions about it? I hope that you will have questions and I will tell you more. But in general, depleted uranium is a big issue. The more I've read about it, the more I know. Depleted uranium is like any other uranium isotope, mixture of isotopes. It has a specific signature. And we know that US has a lot of stockpiles of these. They are a major source of headache because they leak these, storage tanks. You see how they rust and they leak. This is very hard to maintain them, very expensive, and US has a lot of them, as you can see. This is the last figure in 2008. I'm sure by now it has gone up, but I couldn't find any more recent data to show you. But what I'm telling you is that depleted uranium, which has been used in both 1991 and 2003 in Iraq, is a big headache for US chemical, people. They have to maintain it, they have to take care of it. So what I'm thinking is the weapons manufacturers said, oh, we'll take it off your hand. We'll put it in our, tanks and bullets and bombs. And that's what they have done. So we know that in 1991, there was maybe 300 tons of depleted uranium used in Iraq. And my colleague, Dr. Al-Sabak, says that in 92, 93, he could see women coming to him with birth defects. And it started in 1992-3, not only 2003. And the last, the statistics I've been able to find is this 2007 publication of United Nations Environment Program that says an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 metric tons of depleted uranium was dumped in Iraq. Depleted uranium is radioactive. It's 70% radioactive. It remains in the environment. When the bomb that has depleted uranium explodes, the tiny particles become as small as viruses. They can easily be inhaled. They can easily get into the dust and make the dust quite toxic. And this dust keeps come up and gets inhaled by people. So it is a big problem. Depleted uranium is a big problem in Iraq. There has been reports by UN that have been, less advertised. But depleted uranium was dropped there. Depleted uranium emits, it's an ionizing compound, and it causes birth defects. There is a very clear review of articles by Dr. Hindin. She published it in 2005. A very, very good review that fully explains depleted uranium does cause birth defects and cancers, and that is supported by the literature. So we have this problem in Iraq. The research I've done, we have not been able to show that it is in the body of, well, we simply had hair samples and teeth samples and nail samples, so it could be that we missed it, but it is there and people are showing the symptoms. We're seeing birth defects and we're seeing cancers in Iraq. It's a huge amount of radiation to dump on a nation. This is an article that was written by Royal Society saying risks of exposure to depleted uranium. It's a very important article and very quite a bit disseminated and people know about it. So let me quickly, I know my time is probably running out, but what we found in Fallujah. In Fallujah, I'm sorry this picture is quite horrific, but in Fallujah with Dr. Samira Al-Ani, we looked at about 70 families in in them we we had questionnaires, very long procedures, and we were able to show that birth defects are going up and also miscarriages are going up in that population that we studied. These are some of the conditions. Probably you shouldn't look at them very often. I will show you a few reproductive history of these families. In the 60 or 70 families we studied, there was 4 or 5 where you have a husband with 2 wives. And it was an opportunity for us to look deep into the timeline to see how reproduction in this family looked like. Virtually, you can draw a line just after 2003, how people are having children with problems. His first wife, everybody is healthy. Everybody is healthy until the 2003-2004 bombardments, and then you start seeing these. Again, in this family, you see this 2007, and then furthermore. We saw this in several families. This is another, virtually all of them, you will be able to see. And then again, another husband and 2 wives, and you see how many problems. This is quite intriguing and important to notice because there are 3 women involved here. 1, 2, and the daughter of the first wife. And you see, they're all having problems in a normal, clean environment. And these are families who have never had any birth defects in their family before. Never. It has been clean slate all the way. So it is quite a distressing situation. So what did we find in these children from Fallujah? We looked at their hair samples, and as you can see, huge amounts of lead and mercury in hair samples of children from Fallujah. These are children with birth defects. These are children with birth defects. And these are children from the same town without birth defects. So obviously they're being exposed to highly toxic, neurotoxic metals, specifically mercury and lead. Let's see, you want to finish there? Yeah, I guess probably more. So the next city we're going to talk about is Basra. Dr. Al-Sabah was my colleague there. The first study ever to look at the rates of birth defects in Basra was done by him in 1997. It was published, but it's for 1994. And at that time, he showed there is 1.3 per 1,000 live births. Out of 1,000 live births, you have 1.37 birth defects. Let's look at what we found in 2003, 4, until 11. We're working to get more of this data. You see, in 2003, you have a huge increase. And it keeps going up. Some of these years, 48, 45, 44. And he tells me, and he's digging more information now, he tells me it is getting worse. What does it mean if it's getting worse? It means there is more pollution is getting spread around to more people. So you're getting more people showing the effects of it. The third place, I'm trying to be, am I running out of time? I hope not. The third place is Hawija, right here. And this is a place, after we had published information about Basra and Fallujah, some people from Hawija called me. And they said, we have a military base here, and since this military base came, we see neurodevelopmental problems with our children. Things like cerebral palsy. We don't know what it is, but the child does not thrive, and they cannot walk well, and it is getting to be more and more. So can you help us? I said, well, all I can do is to look at the samples, hair samples, if you can send me, and I can see if there is something going on in terms of exposure to pollutants. And we did. We published this article, and what we found was totally striking. These are some of the children who participated. It was actually the doctors wanted to do a bigger study, but they couldn't find people who would participate in the study. Very reluctant to give you samples, to talk to you even. So finally they were able to get about 10 families to give you samples, to fill in the questionnaires, and we did all of that. And what we found, and we used children from Iran to be the control, like to see, compared to them, how is the levels of metals in these children. We found titanium and magnesium extremely high in the children from Iraq, from Hawija, compared to children from Iran, across the border to Iran. We used children in Iran, in south of Iran, because culturally and in many ways they're Arabs in south of Iran, same as the Hawija in Iraq. So what is the importance of finding this titanium contamination? This is a contamination that US doctors have found in soldiers who were on US military bases and were exposed to emissions of those burn pits. So these children have been exposed to the same thing, and this is collecting in their hair samples. Those soldiers, they found titanium and magnesium in their lung tissue. So it's a very strong link between children being exposed and also soldiers being exposed. They're being exposed to the same stuff, and they're collecting it in their bodies. We found other toxins in the children's bodies, and it's quite a very stressful situation. The school, the military base in Hawija, was actually a girls' school. And the US entered in 2003, and they took it over and they turned it into a military base, started doing all kinds of polluting stuff, and now the children are quite a lot suffering to this day. And the people that I still can contact, situation has only gotten worse since 2003, 2004. We're doing some fancy other work. This is tooth samples from Iraq, from Lebanon, and from Iran. This is a very fancy way of detecting metal in deciduous teeth of children. It will show you when the child was exposed. Was it before birth or after birth? It's a fancy thing. Hopefully we can develop it and publish it later. In general, we know these things. We know public has been exposed. We know children exposure to these levels of titanium links their exposure to US military soldiers, a very critical thing to know. And we know that cumulative effect of exposure to all of these toxins will cause health problems to those who have been exposed. These are very general understandings, but very critical if you want to pursue this line of work. So, what is it that we can do to change things? I tell you, when I was in Washington, Seattle, Washington, and we gave a talk at University of Washington, we wrote a resolution for American Public Health Association, asking the American Public Health Association to support a resolution to demand cleanup of US military bases in Iraq. We've been able to make changes and push it further, and we are we're taking steps to hopefully approve it. And once that is approved, we can go with that resolution to US policymakers and ask them to act to clean these bases because they are a source of public exposure to toxins. So hopefully we can do that. That's what I'm thinking, how we can make a difference on the ground, as they say. For people like yourselves who are interested in the topic, there are things you can do. You can ask the parliament, you can ask the city council to, first of all, talk about these things and provide help, provide resolutions, asking for action to be taken. To just say, oh, it is terrible and we cannot do anything about it, it's only depressing. We have to be able to act and do something to prevent it from happening in the future, and also clean it up now. Because I'm sure you have heard, after 40 years, finally the United States is cleaning up some of its military bases in Vietnam that were quite toxic. Maybe 2 or 3 they are thinking of, oh, okay, we will promote, we will clean up. There's no need to wait 40 years to have hundreds and thousands of children born with problems. We can clean it up now.